minutes later.
1 minute later. 1 minute later.
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier!
1 minute 37 seconds later.
One minute 7 splash minutes later.
2 minutes later. 2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 10. 5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
8.5 minutes later.
Approximately 9 minutes later.
10 minutes later.
10 minutes later. 10 minutes later. 10 minutes later.
10 minutes later.
10 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes ago. 15 minutes later.
15 minutes later.
20.
15 minutes later.
10 minutes later.
3 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
25 minutes later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Few minutes later.
A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. Many, many minutes later.
Bye later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later?
1 hour later. 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 1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour.
Before.
One hour of making a new school later.
2 minutes later.
80 minutes later. 2 hours 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 later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 3 2 hours later. 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 Three hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
3 hours later. 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 3 hours later.
3 hours later.
Later. Three hours later after work, then we can do it now, and Ben will be in the office tomorrow morning.
4 hours later. 4 hours later. 4 hours later. 4 hours later.
4 hours later.
4 hours later.
4 to 6 hours later. Hours later. 5 hours later.
5 hours later.
346 minutes later. 365 days later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6.5 hours later. 6.5 hours later. 6.5 hours later. 7 hours later.
7 hours later.
8 hours later. 8 hours later. 8 hours later. 9 hours later. 9.25 hours later. 10 hours later. 10 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later.
11 hours later.
12 hours later. 12 hours later. After Tony's stuff covering tonight's scuba football. 12 sleepless hours later.
12 sleepless hours later.
14 hours later. 24 sleepless hours
62 hours of sleep later.
later. Few hours later.
A few hours later. A few hours later. A few hours later.
A few hours of skibbity toilet later. A few hours of skibbity toilet later again.
Several hours later. Several hard-hitting hours later. Several soda-fueled hours later. Several song-filled hours later.
Several soda-filled hours later.
Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours of fun time later. Many adorable hours later. Many boring hours of cleaning later. Many chilly hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
Many congratulations on your birthday hours later.
Marabosh. 24 hours later.
24 hours later.
24 hours later. 24 hours later.
32 hours later.
72 sleepless hours
90 sleeps hours later. 400 sleeps hours later. 900 sleeps hours later.
934 hours later.